The day my son told his friend I was too old to notice, I was sitting 3 feet away. He didn't see me. That was the first thing he got wrong about me, and it would not be the last. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind that settles over the house like a damp cloth, warm enough to leave the back door open, cool enough to make the incense smoke drift sideways instead of rising straight. I had lit 2 sticks at my husband's altar before sitting down at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and a cup of bitter tea I had been meaning to finish for an hour. The flame on the altar candle was steady. Hung had always liked a steady flame. He said a restless flame meant restless thoughts in the room. That night, the flame did not move at all. Min was in the hallway. Tuan was with him, I could tell by the way. Min's voice changed, lower and looser. The voice he used only when he thought no one important was listening. They were not whispering. That was the second thing he got wrong. He assumed that because I was old, I was also somewhere far away, inside my own head, unreachable. 38 years as a hospital nurse had trained me to hear everything. A patient's breathing changing 2 rooms down, a monitor's rhythm shifting by half a second. A family member crying quietly so no one would ask them to stop. I heard my son say it clearly. She won't remember anyway. She's old now, confused. Whatever she signs, she won't know she signed it. Tuan laughed. It was a short sound, careful, the laugh of a man who wants to agree but still needs to feel respectable. I did not move. I did not look up from my glasses. I lifted my tea, took a slow sip, and set the cup back down without a sound. That was the moment everything changed, not because of what Minj said, but because of what I decided, in the space of one quiet breath, not to do. I did not stand up. I did not walk to the hallway. I did not let them know I had heard a single word. I smiled, just barely, at the rim of my cup. Some people would call that weakness. I had spent 68 years learning that it was the opposite. Let me go back to where this story really begins. Because a wound like this one does not open in a single night. It opens slowly, over years, along a seam you didn't know was there until you press on it and feel the give. I am Lei Thier Ho. I was born in the year of the rabbit, in a province town where the mornings smelled like river water and wood smoke and my mother's pho broth all at once. I grew up with 3 sisters and a father who believed that a woman's most powerful possession was not beauty or obedience but the ability to stay quiet long enough to understand a situation fully before acting. He said this while fixing a broken bicycle wheel once, his hands steady and unhurried, and I never forgot it. I became a nurse at 22. I worked the same hospital floor for 38 years, pediatric, then general, then, finally, the terminal ward, where I learned more about human nature than any other place could have taught me. The dying are honest in a way the living rarely manage. They tell you the truth about their families, their regrets, the things they wish they had said or not said or done differently while there was still time. I held their hands. I listened. I filed the information away, the way I filed everything quietly, carefully, in a place where it would keep. I retired 5 years ago. Not because I wanted to, but because my knees had made a decision my heart had not caught up with yet. I came home to this house, the one Hung and I bought in 1987 with money we had saved for 11 years, coin by coin, month by month, the way people built things back then, with patience and without shortcuts. The house had a mango tree in the back that Hung planted the year Min was born. It still bears fruit every summer. I pick them myself. I do not need help. Hung died 3 years ago, quietly, as he had lived in the early morning, before I had finished making his tea, with his hands folded on the blanket and his face turned slightly toward the window. The doctors said it was his heart. I thought it was more accurate to say his heart had simply done all it intended to do and stopped, satisfied. I buried him, mourned him properly, and then I continued. That is what you do. You continue. Min was 42. He had his father's wide forehead, and none of his father's patience. He had worked in real estate for 15 years, or said he had moving from one agency to another, with reasons that were always almost convincing. He called me every Sunday. Sometimes he came for dinner. He always left before the dishes were done, which I mention not with bitterness but simply as observation. You learn to notice the small things. The small things are usually the honest things. Tuan I had known since Min was in secondary school. He had worked at a bank for over a decade before something happened. I never learned exactly what, only that his manner afterward was different, quieter in a slippery way, like a person who has started watching exits. He still dressed well, he still smiled easily, but the smile had moved slightly out of alignment with his eyes, the way a painting shifts on its hook after an earthquake, almost imperceptible, but wrong. I had noticed. I had filed it away. That night in October, sitting at my kitchen table with my cold tea and my husband's steady flame, I replayed Minja's words the way I used to replay a patient's chart, not with emotion, but with attention. She won't remember anyway. Whatever she signs, she won't know she signed it. He was talking about money. He was talking about papers. He was talking about something that had already begun, or was about to begin, and he had said it 3 feet from where I sat because he had looked at me and seen an old woman and concluded, with the lazy confidence of someone who has never been wrong about anything that mattered, that old women are furniture. I finished my tea. I washed my cup. I said goodnight to Hung's photograph, the one where he is laughing at something outside the frame, the one where he looks most like himself. Then I went to bed, but I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and I thought about something my grandmother used to say when I was small and impatient and wanted things to move faster than they moved. Still water, she would say. Still water runs deepest. I had been still for 68 years. I was very, very deep. I did not know yet what Min had taken, or how much, or how long it had been happening. But I knew, with the calm certainty of a woman who has watched enough people die to understand what matters and what doesn't, that I would find out. I would find out everything. And I would wait until I had every single piece before I moved even one hand. The incense had burned down to ash by the time I closed my eyes. The candle on Hung's altar had gone out on its own. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go to the bank. There is a photograph on Hung's altar that most visitors do not notice. It sits behind the incense holder, half hidden by the small ceramic cup I use for tea offerings. And it is not a formal portrait. It is a snapshot someone took at a hospital picnic in 1983, a coworker, I think, though I no longer remember who. In it, Hung and I are standing beside a folding table covered with plastic wrap and bowls of food. He is looking at me. I am looking at something outside the frame, laughing at whatever it was. His expression in that photograph is the one I think of most when I think of him, not the serious face he wore for important occasions, not the tired face he wore in his final years, but that one, quiet attention. The look of a man who found watching his wife laugh to be sufficient entertainment for an afternoon. I have kept that photograph for 41 years. I will keep it until I cannot. We met in 1979. I was working the children's ward. He was a maintenance technician who came to fix a broken ceiling fan in the staff break room and stayed 20 minutes longer than the job required, asking me questions about whether the patients on our floor were frightened at night, and whether the lighting was adequate, and whether anyone had ever thought to put pictures on the walls to make it feel less like a hospital. I told him I had thought about it often but had no authority to do it. He said authority was overrated. The following week, 3 watercolor prints appeared on the break room wall. I never asked how he arranged it. I simply noted that he was a man who identified a problem and then quietly solved it without fanfare, without needing credit. I decided before I finished my shift that day that I would marry him. It took 2 more years for the rest of it to unfold, but I was never in doubt. I am not a woman who second-guesses herself on the things that matter. We were married in 1,981 inches, a ceremony that was modest by any measure, a rented hall, my mother's cooking, paper flowers my sisters had spent a week making by hand. We had very little money. What we had was clarity about what we were doing and why, which is a far more stable foundation than money, as it turns out. We moved into a small apartment near the hospital and began the long, deliberate work of building a life. I use that word building because that is how it felt. Not falling into something, not drifting. We made choices the way craftspeople make things, with attention and intention, and the understanding that the quality of what you produce depends entirely on the quality of what you put in. We saved money in a tin box under the bed for the first 3 years. Then in a bank account, once we trusted banks enough. Then in a second account when the first one felt too accessible, too easy to reach into on a hard month. Hung used to say that saving money was a form of respect for your future self. I thought that was a very beautiful way to think about it. I still do. Min was born in 1982. He arrived in November, 3 weeks early, which meant I spent most of my maternity leave convinced something was wrong, monitoring him with the professional attention of a nurse and the irrational terror of a new mother. Nothing was wrong. He was simply impatient. Looking back now, I wonder if I should have recognized that as information. He was a bright child, quick to talk, quick to form opinions, quick to move on from things once they stopped interesting him. His father taught him to fix small appliances, fans, radios, the occasional lamp, and Min was good at it when he tried, which was less often than Hung hoped and more often than I expected. He did well enough in school. He had friends. He was not an unhappy child, and we were not an unhappy family. But there was something in him, even then, that I could not quite name, a kind of restlessness that went deeper than energy, a tendency to look at what he had and calculate immediately what it was not, rather than what it was. I do not say this unkindly. I say it the way a doctor notes a symptom, not with judgment, but with the understanding that symptoms mean something, and that ignoring them does not make them disappear. We bought this house in 1987. The negotiation took 4 months, and the mortgage took 22 years to pay off, and the day we made the final payment, Hung went to the backyard and planted the mango tree. He did not tell me he was going to do it. I came home from a late shift and found him there in the dark with a flashlight and a hole already dug, tamping down the soil around the roots with the flat of his palm. "What is this?" I asked him. He looked up. "A mango tree," he said, as though it were obvious. "I know it is a mango tree," I said. "Why tonight?" He thought about it. "Because it will take 10 years to bear fruit. And I want us to still be here when it does." We were. The tree bore its first mangoes in 1997. We ate them standing in the backyard in the July heat, juice running down our wrists, laughing at nothing in particular, the way you laugh when life briefly exceeds what you had let yourself expect from it. I kept the altar simple after Hung died. His photograph, the formal one from our wedding anniversary in 2005, because his mother had wanted a formal one and I had wanted the picnic snapshot, and we had compromised 2 incense holders, a small cup for tea, a bowl for fruit. I changed the fruit every 3 days. I talked to him sometimes, not long conversations, just small observations, the way you might speak to someone reading in the next room. The flame is usually steady. I take comfort in that. The house is old now in the way that good things get old, worn in the places that have been most used, solid everywhere else. The kitchen floor has a slight dip near the stove from 30 years of standing in that spot. The back door requires a specific 2-step motion to open, lift slightly, then turn, that I do without thinking and that visitors find baffling. The mango tree is enormous now. Its shadow reaches the kitchen window in the late afternoon. I know every sound this house makes. I know which floorboard creaks in the hallway outside Min's old room, the 1/3 from the left, the one that sings a particular low note when weight shifts onto it at an angle. I know the sound of the gate in the wind, the sound of the water pipes in the morning, the sound of the neighbor's dog when something has disturbed it in the night. I know the sound of someone trying to move quietly through my house when they think I am asleep. I had heard that sound twice in the month before October. Both times, I lay still and listened, and both times I heard the hallway creak, and both times by morning there was nothing visibly different, nothing I could point to, nothing concrete enough to name. But something had shifted, the way a photograph shifts on its hook, the way a flame bends without wind. I went to the bank the following morning as I had decided. I dressed carefully, my dark blue al-baba, my good shoes, my hair pinned properly, because I have always believed that the way you present yourself to a situation is a form of respect for it, and what I was walking into deserved my full respect. The woman at the front desk smiled when I approached. I told her I would like to review all transactions on my account for the past 18 months. Her smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes made a small, almost imperceptible adjustment. And that adjustment told me everything I needed to know about what I was about to find. The bank was quiet at 8:30 in the morning. That was why I had chosen that hour. Fewer people, shorter lines, and something else, a quality of attention that exists in institutions early in the day, before the accumulated weight of transactions and difficult conversations has dulled the staff into performing their duties rather than actually doing them. I wanted someone who was still capable of genuine attention. I wanted to be looked at, not processed. The woman who had smiled at me the day before was not there. Instead, a young man with careful hair and a new-looking tie led me to a desk near the back window and offered me tea, which I declined, and water, which I accepted, and then sat across from me with the posture of someone who has been trained to appear helpful while actually managing the flow of information very carefully. I told him what I wanted. All transactions, 18 months, every entry. He typed something, looked at his screen, typed again. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds longer than it should have, and in those 4 seconds, I watched his face the way I used to watch patients' faces when I delivered news, looking not at the words they were preparing to say, but at the moment just before the words, when the truth was still visible. His face, in that moment, told me the number was going to be bad. He printed the document, 12 pages, which surprised me. I had expected fewer. He paperclipped them together and placed them on the desk between us and began to explain the summary, but I was already reading, and I held up one hand, gently, the way you quiet a room without commanding it, and he stopped. I read. The account had held 840 million dong as of 16 months ago. I knew this. I had built that number over 38 years, adding to it with the discipline of someone who understood that money saved was future security made concrete, that every sacrifice now was a gift to the version of yourself who would one day be too old or too ill or simply too tired to keep working. 840 million dong. Not a fortune by some measures. By mine, it was everything. The current balance was 212,000 dong. I read the transaction history from the beginning. I did not rush. I turned each page deliberately, the way you turn the pages of a patient's file when you are looking for the origin of a problem rather than just its current presentation. The withdrawals had begun 14 months ago, small at first 15 million, then 20, then 30, spaced irregularly enough to avoid any single month looking dramatic, then larger, 50 million in March, 70 in May. A series of transfers in July and August that each fell just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic review. Someone had known exactly where that threshold was. The authorization on every transaction was the same. A power of attorney document filed with the bank 14 months ago, granting Nguyen Van Minh full transactional authority over the account. The document listed a notary stamp I did not recognize from an office in a district I had no business with. I set the papers down, squared the edges, placed them flat on the desk. I had not signed any power of attorney. Not 14 months ago. Not ever. The young man was watching me with an expression. I recognized the expression of someone who knows something uncomfortable is unfolding and has not yet determined whether they are required to be part of it. I looked at him directly, calmly, the way I had learned to look at families delivering difficult news in a manner that was honest without being unkind. I would like a copy of the power of attorney document, I said, the original filing. He hesitated for exactly the wrong amount of time. Of course, he said. I'll need to request it from records. It may take a few days. That is fine, I said. I would also like these transaction records certified. All 12 pages. And I would like the name and contact information of the notary listed on the authorization. He wrote things down. His pen moved slowly. I waited. I left the bank at 10:47 with a certified copy of 12 pages of transaction history, a promise that the power of attorney document would be available within 3 business days, and the address of a notary office that, I already suspected, no longer existed at the location listed. The walk to the bus stop was 4 minutes. I walked slowly, not because my knees were troubled that morning, but because I was thinking, and I think better when my body is occupied with something uncomplicated. 14 months. The withdrawals had begun 1 month after Hung's funeral. I had been in the deepest part of grief then, not the dramatic, visible grief of the first days, but the quieter, more disorienting grief that comes later, when the condolence visits stop and the food stops arriving and the world resumes its ordinary pace, and you are left alone with the absence of a person who had occupied your daily life for 42 years. I had been sleeping poorly. I had been forgetting small things, appointments, the names of television programs, whether I had eaten lunch. Nothing serious. Nothing that would alarm a doctor. But enough. enough that someone watching me closely would have recognized the window. I sat on the bus and looked at my hands in my lap. They were steady. They had always been steady. It was one of the things that had made me a good nurse, that steadiness, the ability to perform careful tasks while the rest of me was entirely calm, because panic was not useful, and I had trained myself out of it decades ago. But underneath the steadiness, something else was present. Not anger, not yet. Something older and colder and more precise than anger. Recognition. I had seen this before. Not exactly this, not this specific arrangement of documents and transfers and careful timing, but the shape of it. The shape of someone identifying a vulnerable person and moving carefully around their edges, testing the boundaries, removing things slowly enough that the removal might not be noticed until it was complete. I had seen it in the hospital sometimes, with elderly patients whose families managed their finances, and I had always noted it with a particular kind of sorrow, not just for the patient, but for the family member, for what it meant about who they had become and how they had gotten there. I had not imagined I would one day be the patient. At home, I placed the documents on the kitchen table and made tea and sat with them for 2 hours. I read the transaction history 3 more times. I made notes in a small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, the one I used for grocery lists and medication schedules, and the phone numbers of people I did not want to store in my phone where they might be seen. I wrote down dates, amounts, the pattern of spacing, the total removed to date, 839,788,000 dong. They had left me 212,000. That was not carelessness, that was a decision. Leaving some amount, however small, meant the account remained open, remained active, remained something that would not trigger an automatic bank notification of closure. Someone had calculated what minimum was required to keep the account technically functioning. Someone who knew how banks worked. I thought about Tuan, his decade in banking. The way his eyes had moved when I saw him last assessing, calculating, landing nowhere long enough to be caught. I closed my notebook. I drank my tea. Outside, the mango tree shifted in a wind I couldn't feel from inside, its large leaves turning briefly to show their pale undersides that silvery flip that always came before a change in weather. I had 3 days before the power of attorney document would be ready. 3 days was enough time to make several quiet inquiries. About notary offices, about what exactly was required to file a power of attorney at a bank, about what happened, legally, when such a document was found to be fraudulent. I picked up my phone and found the number I was looking for, a number I had not used in 4 years, since the woman who owned it had been my patient, briefly, before she recovered and resumed her life, and had pressed her card into my hand on the day she was discharged and said, with the gravity of someone who meant it precisely, "If you ever need anything, please call me." Her name was Pham Thuy Lin. She was a lawyer. I did not call her that evening. I was not ready yet. I needed to be certain, and certainty required the document. And the document required 3 more days. But I set her number on the table beside my notebook, where I could see it. And I went to the altar and changed the incense and spoke to Hung's photograph, not out loud this time, just in my mind. The particular interior conversation that had replaced our evening talks since he left, and what I said was this: "I think I understand now why you always told Min that a man's character is not what he shows when people are watching. It is what he does when he believes no one can see him." The candle flame, for the first time in weeks, bent sideways without any wind to move it. The notary office did not exist. I found this out on the 2nd morning, before the bank had even called to confirm the power of attorney document was ready. I had written down the address from the transaction records, a street in District 7, a building number, a suite, and I had taken the bus there myself because I wanted to see it with my own eyes rather than trust someone else's account of it. I have always preferred primary sources. 38 years in medicine had taught me that second-hand information, even from well-meaning people, arrives slightly reshaped by the assumptions of whoever carried it. The building existed. A narrow 4-story structure with a pharmacy on the ground floor and a tailor's shop beside it. I checked the suite number twice against my notebook. I went inside and found the directory board in the entrance hallway, a metal frame with white plastic letters, the kind you slide in and rearrange. Suite 204 listed a dental clinic. Suite 206 listed an accounting firm that, based on the dust on the directory letters, had not updated its information in some time. there was no notary. There had not been one, judging by the board, in recent memory. I climbed the stairs anyway. I am 68 and my knees have opinions about stairs, but I climbed them because I wanted to stand in the hallway outside Suite 205, the number listed on the power of attorney document, and see what was there. There was a door with no nameplate, and a narrow gap at the bottom through which I could see the particular quality of light that indicates an empty room. Not a room between tenants. Not a room being prepared for someone. A room that had been empty long enough for the air inside it to settle into stillness. I stood there for a moment. Then I went back downstairs. On the bus home, I opened my notebook and wrote, Suite 205, Building 14, the street in District 7, empty. No evidence of occupancy. Notary stamp on POA document cannot be verified at listed address. Then I underlined it. Not from agitation. From clarity. The bank called that afternoon to say the document was ready. I went the following morning, the third day, as promised, and the same young man with the careful tie met me at the same desk and placed a folder in front of me with the air of someone handing over something they would prefer not to be handing over. Inside was a photocopy of the power of attorney document. 4 pages, formal language, the kind that is designed to sound authoritative through density rather than precision. My name at the top, Min's name below it, the notary stamp at the bottom of the final page, round, official looking, the name of the office printed in a clean serif font. I read it twice. Then I looked at the signature on the third page. It was my signature. Or rather, it was a version of my signature close enough that someone unfamiliar with it would not hesitate, but wrong in the way that copies are always subtly wrong, the way a recording of a voice is recognizable but not quite the same as hearing it in the same room. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over 38 years. On patient charts, on medication approvals, on discharge forms, on birthday cards, on the deed to this house, on the mortgage payment that took 22 years to complete. I knew my signature the way I knew my own breathing, not by looking at it analytically, but by feel, by the particular rhythm of it. This signature had been produced by someone who had studied mine carefully and replicated the shape but missed the rhythm. The loop at the end of my family name was too deliberate, the pressure of the pen too even. My actual signature has a slight inconsistency in the middle, a hesitation that became habitual decades ago and that I have never been able to eliminate, and it was absent here. I photographed the document with my phone. Then I photographed each page individually. Then I asked the young man if I could have a certified copy, and he said yes. And I waited while he processed it. And I took the certified copy and placed it in my bag beside my notebook and thanked him. He looked relieved when I left. That evening I called Pham Thuy Linh. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was the same as I remembered. Measured, direct. The voice of a woman who has spent decades distilling complicated situations into their essential components. She said my name as though she had been expecting to hear from me eventually, which was either coincidence or the particular attentiveness of someone who pays close attention to the people who have helped them. I told her what I had found. I was concise. I gave her the numbers, the dates, the address that did not match, the signature that was not quite mine. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you bring me everything tomorrow morning?" I said yes. Then she said something that I had not expected. She said, "Before you come, I want you to check one more thing. Look at the date on the power of attorney document, the date of notarization, and cross-reference it against anything you have from that period. Receipts, medical appointments, anything that establishes where you were that day." I wrote down the date from the document. November 14th of the previous year. 14 months ago. 3 weeks after Hung's funeral. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about November 14th. It took me a moment. Grief does something to memory, compresses certain periods and stretches others in ways that are not always predictable, but then it came to me. November 14th had been a Wednesday. I knew this because Wednesdays in November I had been attending a grief support group at the community center near the hospital where I had worked. A nurse I had known for 20 years had recommended it gently, in the way that people who care about you recommend things they cannot quite bring themselves to prescribe outright. I had attended every Wednesday in November. 8 in the morning until 10. I had signed the attendance register each time because the group facilitator was organized in the particular way of former teachers and kept careful records. My name would be in that register. My handwriting. The time. The date. I found my bag from that period. I rotate bags seasonally, and the one from last November was in the wardrobe, a dark green fabric bag with a broken clasp I kept meaning to fix. Inside, in the inner pocket, I found what I always find in my bags from any given period: a folded bus ticket, a receipt, a small packet of tissues, and the business card of the grief group facilitator, which she had given me on the first day, and a receipt, dated November 14th. Time stamped 8:47 inches the morning. The community center canteen, 1 cup of tea, 1 steamed bun, the small breakfast I had bought before the session began. I was at the community center on November 14th at 8:47 in the morning. The power of attorney document was notarized, according to its stamp, at 9:15 that same morning. At an office in District 7, that did not exist, I set the receipt on the table beside the certified copy of the document. I placed my notebook between them. I looked at the 3 items arranged in a row and felt the thing that happens when a complicated picture suddenly simplifies, not relief, exactly, but resolution. The moment when what you suspected becomes what you know. Someone had forged my signature on a specific date when I was provably somewhere else. Someone had used a notary stamp from an office that had never existed. And someone had done this 3 weeks after my husband's funeral, when I was grieving and distracted, and they had calculated least likely to be paying attention to the balance of a bank account. I photographed the receipt. I added it to the folder. Then I went to the altar and changed the water in the offering cup and stood for a while looking at Hung's photograph, not the formal one, but the picnic one, which I had moved to the front recently without quite deciding to, and I thought about what Tuan had looked like the last time I had seen him, 3 months ago, when Min had brought him for dinner unannounced and I had made enough food without comment because that is what you do, and Tuan had complimented my cooking with the particular enthusiasm of someone who is working to be remembered fondly. I thought about how he had excused himself to use the bathroom and been gone for 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a long time to be in a bathroom. I had noted it at the time, filed it, and said nothing. Now I opened my notebook and wrote it down for the first time, and then I wrote below it the question that had been sitting quietly at the back of my mind since the bank and the empty office and the receipt with its 8:47 timestamp. If Tuan had been in this house while I was occupied with dinner, moving between rooms in a space he had visited enough times to know the layout, with 11 minutes and a goal in mind. I stopped writing, looked up. I had a small lockbox in the bedroom. Dark metal, combination lock, kept on the high shelf of the wardrobe, behind a stack of folded blankets. Inside it, the deed to the house, my retirement papers, Hung's death certificate, and a notebook separate from the kitchen one, older, where I recorded important numbers and account information in a system only I understood. I had not checked that lockbox in 4 months. I set down my pen, rose from the table, and walked to the bedroom. The wardrobe door was exactly as I had left it. The blankets were exactly as I had left them. But when I lifted the stack and reached for the lockbox and felt its weight in my hands, I understood immediately. Before I had even turned the dial, before I had even opened it, the weight was wrong. The lockbox was lighter because it was empty. Not entirely. The deed to the house was still there. I felt its familiar weight and thickness before I even looked inside, the slightly heavier paper stock that legal documents use, the kind that holds its shape across decades. Hung's death certificate was there. My retirement papers. The things too large and too obviously missed to remove without immediate consequence. But the notebook was gone. I stood in my bedroom with the open lockbox in my hands and looked at the space where the notebook had been for 11 years, a dark blue notebook. Narrow, the kind sold at the post office, unremarkable in every way except for what was written inside it. Account numbers, bank branch codes. The combination to the lockbox itself, written in a notation system I had developed over years of managing medication schedules where clarity mattered but privacy also mattered. The access codes for my online banking profile, which I had written down because I did not trust myself to remember them and did not trust technology to store them safely. Everything someone would need to navigate my finances without asking me. I set the lockbox on the bed. I sat beside it. The combination lock showed no signs of tampering, no scratches around the dial, no marks on the casing. Either Tuan had found the notebook in which I had also written the combination before I had moved that particular notation to a different location 3 years ago, or he had watched someone open it, or there was a third explanation I had not yet identified. I sat with this for a while, turning it slowly in my mind the way you work a stiff joint, not forcing it, just moving it gently until the range of motion becomes clear. 11 minutes in the bathroom. The bathroom shared a wall with my bedroom. The bedroom door, which I had left open because I had been moving between rooms that evening, preparing dinner, paying attention to the stove and not to the hallway. A man with 11 minutes and knowledge of what he was looking for. The wardrobe was tall. The shelf where the lockbox sat required effort to reach, not impossible effort, but enough that a shorter person would have needed something to stand on. I looked at the floor of the wardrobe. The small wooden stool I kept there for exactly that purpose had been moved 6 inches to the left of where I always placed it. 6 inches. I placed it back. Looked at the indentation in the wardrobe floor where its legs had sat for years, the faint compression in the old wood. The stool's legs now sat slightly outside those marks. That was not how I had left it. I photographed the stool. I photographed the marks. I photographed the empty interior of the lockbox. Then I closed it, put it back on the shelf, rearranged the blankets, and walked to the kitchen and sat down and was very still for a long time. The notebook was gone, but I was a nurse for 38 years, and nurses maintain records not because they are told to, but because they understand that the moment will come when memory is not sufficient and documentation is the only thing standing between a patient and a serious error. I had kept records of everything, in multiple locations, because I had also learned over 38 years of watching institutional systems fail in small and large ways that a single point of record is a single point of failure. The notebook was gone, but I had other notebooks. I had papers filed in 3 different locations in this house, and I had a folder at the community center where I volunteered on Thursdays, and I had an envelope at my sister's house in the next district, containing copies of the documents I considered most critical, placed there 6 years ago when my neighbor's house had flooded, and she had lost papers she could not replace. I had not survived 38 years of shift work in Vietnamese public hospitals by being careless with important information, but they did not know that. Tuan had taken the notebook and likely assumed the problem was solved. Min had arranged the bank transfers and likely assumed the account would remain unexamined until I was either informed by him, on his terms, or until I was no longer here to be informed at all. I thought about that second possibility for exactly as long as it took me to understand its implications, and then I put it away. Not because it was comfortable to dismiss, but because dwelling on it served no useful purpose. What I needed was to be methodical. Methodical was something I knew how to be. The following morning I went to Pham Thuy Lin's office. She was smaller than I remembered. Grief and time do something to our memories of people, sometimes enlarging them, sometimes reducing them, always altering them slightly from the original. She stood when I came in and shook my hand with both of hers, and held it a moment longer than a formal greeting required, which was the gesture of someone who remembered not just the fact of what I had done for them but the feeling of it. I had sat with her through 3 nights in the hospital 4 years ago, when her condition had been uncertain and her husband had not been present, and she had been afraid in the particular way that competent, self-sufficient people are afraid when they find themselves in a situation they cannot manage through competence and self-sufficiency. I had stayed, that was all. But staying, I have found, is often the thing that is remembered longest. I gave her the folder. She read in silence, which I appreciated, rather than narrating her reactions while she read, which I find unhelpful. She went through the bank records first, then the certified copy of the power of attorney document, then the receipt from November 14th with its 8:47 timestamp. She held the document and the receipt side by side for a moment. Then she set them down and looked at me. "This is forgery," she said. "I know," I said. "The notary stamp is fabricated." She set the document down. "I have a contact at the district notary registry. I can have this stamp verified or unverified within 2 days. That gives us the documentation to file a criminal complaint rather than just a civil one." I told her about the notebook then, about the 11 minutes, about the stool. She was quiet for a moment, Then she said, "How long ago did this happen? The dinner?" 3 months ago, I said. She wrote something down. "And the lockbox, when did you last confirm the notebook was there before discovering it missing?" I had to think. The previous February. I had opened the lockbox to retrieve my retirement papers for an annual review of my pension disbursement. 8 months, she said. 8 months? I agreed. She wrote this down also. Then she set her pen on the desk and looked at me in the way that people look at you when they are about to say something they have considered carefully and decided you are capable of receiving. "There is something else I need to ask you," she said, "and I need you to think carefully before answering." I nodded. "In the period between your husband's death and the first bank withdrawal, the month between those two events, was there anything that required you to produce your identification documents? Your national identity card? Your household registration book?" I thought about that month. The funeral arrangements. The paperwork at the civil registry office to register Hung's death. The bank, where I had gone to remove his name from our joint accounts and consolidate them. The notary where I had gone to have his will processed. "The notary," I said slowly. "I went to a notary office for the estate paperwork. I produced my identity card. I signed documents." She nodded, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, but the look of a hypothesis confirmed. "Which notary office?" she asked. And I described it to her, the address, the building, the man at the desk who had been professional and quiet and efficient and had held my identity card for what I now realized had been slightly longer than necessary before returning it. Pham Thuy Linh looked at me for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop and turned it to face me. On the screen was a record from the district business registry. A notary office, registered at an address I did not recognize, licensed for a period of 14 months, voluntarily dissolved and deregistered. Date of dissolution, 2 months after my husband's funeral. Date of registration, 8 months before his death. I looked at the registration date again. I looked at the name of the registered owner, which I had not focused on at first because I had been looking at the dates. The registered owner was a business entity with a name I did not recognize. But the listed administrative contact, the person designated to receive official correspondence, was listed as Tran Duc Tuan. The room did not change. The light through the window was the same. Pham Thuy Linh's desk was the same, and the folder of my documents was the same, and my hands in my lap were the same steady hands they had always been. But the picture had changed completely. Tuan had not helped Min exploit an opportunity that arose after Hung's death. Tuan had built the mechanism 8 months before Hung died, while my husband was still alive, while I was still working, while our life was still intact, and nothing had yet happened that would justify such a preparation. He had not seen a window, he had constructed one. And I understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that there was one more question I had not yet asked, one I had been avoiding without fully knowing. I was avoiding it about how much Min had known, and when, and whether the man I had raised had helped plan this before he had any reason to know he would need to. Pham Thuy Linh was watching me. She did not rush me. She simply waited. I looked at my hands. I looked at the business registry on her screen. I looked at Tuan's name in the administrative contact field, printed in plain black text on a white background, indifferent and factual and devastating. And then I asked the question I had been avoiding. "How long," I said, "has my son known Tuan was doing this?" Pham Thuy Linh did not answer immediately. Her silence was its own answer. I did not sleep the night after Pham Thuy Linh's office. Not from distress, exactly. I have lived long enough to know the difference between the sleeplessness that comes from fear and the sleeplessness that comes from a mind that has received too much information to process horizontally. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, and I let the pieces arrange themselves the way pieces arrange themselves when you stop trying to force them slowly, without drama, finding their own edges. By 4 a.m, I had a cleaner picture than I had managed to construct in 2 hours of deliberate thinking. Tuan had registered the notary business 8 months before Hung died. This meant he had not identified an opportunity after the funeral. He had built the infrastructure before there was a vacancy, which meant he had anticipated the vacancy, which meant he had anticipated Hung's death with enough confidence to invest time and money in preparation for its aftermath. Hung had been ill for 14 months before he passed. Not dramatically ill, not the kind of illness that announces itself clearly to the outside world. but ill enough that our doctor had spoken to us about timelines carefully and with the particular gentleness that doctors use when they want to communicate seriousness without removing hope. Ill enough that Min had known. I had told Min myself, because he was our son and he had a right to know, and because I had genuinely believed that telling him was an act of inclusion, of trust, of the ordinary transparency that families extend to each other in difficult times. Min had known that Hung was dying. Ming had told Tun. And Tuan had gone to the business registry and filed the paperwork for a notary office. I turned this over in my mind in the dark for a long time. There are things you can know intellectually and things you can know in your body, and they are not always the same thing, and the distance between them is not always crossable quickly. I had known, somewhere below language, since the October evening in the kitchen, that my son had participated in this. But knowing abstractly and specifically understanding the timeline, the sequence, the deliberate construction of it while his father was still alive, and I was still sitting at hospital bedsides learning how much time we had left, those were different things. I lay in the dark and felt the full weight of it, and then I set it aside. Not because I had finished with it, but because I needed to be functional in the mourning, and grief, like everything else, has to be managed in its proper time. At 5:30 I rose, made tea, and sat at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook, not the kitchen one, not the blue one that was gone, but a new one I had bought at the post office 2 days ago, brown cover, which I had chosen because it looked like something a person buys to record grocery lists, not something a person buys because they are documenting evidence against their son. I wrote down everything Pham Thuy Lin and I had discussed. Not impressions or emotions or interpretations. Facts, dates, amounts, document references, in the clean abbreviated style I had used for 38 years on patient charts. The notation that communicated precisely and efficiently and could be read by someone else and understood without requiring my presence to explain it. Then I opened a separate page and wrote, what I still need. The list was longer than the evidence I had. I needed the original notary registry filing, not just the online record, but the physical documentation, which would show the handwriting on the application and the supporting documents used to establish the business. I needed the bank's complete internal records around the power of attorney filing, who had received the document, who had processed it, whether any flags had been raised and dismissed. I needed to establish precisely when the notebook had been taken from my lockbox, which required working backward through my own movements and Min and Tuan's visits to this house. And I needed to know whether any other documents in my name had been created, filed, or used without my knowledge. The power of attorney was the one I had found. It did not mean it was the only one. I began with what I could do myself, without involving Pham Thuy Lin yet, because lawyers are useful at the right moment and premature at others, and what I needed now was information gathering, not legal action. My neighbor in joke opened her shop at 6:30. I was there at 6:45. Ostensibly to buy cooking oil, which I did not need, and tea, which I always needed, and to stand at the counter in the way that the women of my generation have always stood at the counters of small shops, unhurried, present, with the particular quality of available attention that invites conversation without demanding it. NGOC was 65 and had lived in this neighborhood for 30 years and possessed the comprehensive social knowledge of someone who has operated a small business on a residential street for 3 decades. She knew who visited whom, and when, and in what vehicles, and with what demeanor. She was not a gossip in the pejorative sense. She was an observer, as most people are who are paid attention to rarely enough that they have learned to pay attention themselves instead. I mentioned, as though it had just occurred to me, that I had been thinking about updating my house insurance and wondered if Min had come by recently to look at some documents I had set aside for him. Njok set down the bottle of oil she was shelving and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a question without knowing they were waiting. He came 3 times in October, she said. Once with his friend, the tall one, well-dressed. Twice alone. The twice alone visits were short. 20 minutes. Maybe less. I nodded, as though this was not particularly interesting information. Did he seem I searched for the right word, purposeful, like someone with an errand? She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. More like someone checking something, she said finally. Not arriving, not leaving, checking. Like he was making sure a thing was still in its place. I thanked her. I bought the tea. I walked home. In my notebook, I wrote, Min visited twice alone in October. Short visits. Checking. What had he been checking? Whether I had noticed. Whether anything had changed. Whether the account was being monitored. Whether I had been to the bank. Whether the surface of my daily life showed any sign of disruption. I had shown none. I had not known then what I was not showing. But this meant Min had been watching, and watching required access to information about my patterns, my habits, my relationship with the bank. He would have needed to know if I checked the account online, and how often, and whether I had standing appointments that might lead me there. I did not check the account online. I did not trust online banking, which Min knew because he had offered to set it up for me twice in 2 years and I had declined both times, gently, explaining that I preferred to visit the branch in person. He had teased me about it once. Old-fashioned, he had said, with a particular fondness that is sometimes genuine and sometimes a form of inventory taking. Old-fashioned meant predictable. Predictable meant manageable. I made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to the community center near the hospital, where I had attended the grief group last November. I asked whether they kept attendance records from the previous year. The woman I spoke to said yes, all records were kept for 3 years, and I asked if I could come in to have a specific date verified, and she said of course, whenever I liked. The second call was to a woman named Ha, who had been a records administrator at my hospital for 20 years before her retirement, and who possessed both an intimate understanding of documentation systems and an absolute silence about whatever was told to her in confidence. I had helped her youngest son navigate a difficult situation with his employer 4 years ago, nothing dramatic, simply a matter of knowing which questions to ask and to whom, and she had told me then that she owed me a debt I should not hesitate to collect. I told her what I needed, not everything, enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is a man at the district land registry who owes me a comparable debt. If anyone has filed documents in your name that touch on property, he would be able to tell us without creating an official inquiry trail." I wrote this down. Then I said, "I need to know if there are any documents beyond the power of attorney, any filings, any signatures in my name in the past 18 months. She said she would make a call. My grandmother used to say that bamboo bends in the storm while the oak breaks, and everyone admires the oak for its strength right up until the moment it falls. I had spent my life learning to bend toward difficult patience, toward institutional frustrations, toward grief and loss and the ordinary disappointments of a long life without mistaking bending for yielding. I was bending now, gathering. Moving through the necessary motions of an ordinary day while the current beneath ran deep and purposeful and entirely invisible to anyone watching from the outside. Ha called back at 7 that evening. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone managing the weight of what they are about to say. "There is one more document," she said. "Filed 8 months ago. It is not a power of attorney." I waited. "It is a property transfer declaration," she said. "Preliminary, not completed, not registered, but filed. For this house." I looked at the wall where Hung had measured the window frame for curtains in 1987, the pencil marks I had never painted over. "In whose name?" I asked. "Nguyen Van Min," she said, "and Tran Duc Tuan. Both of them." I set down the phone and sat in the stillness of my kitchen for a long time. They had not just taken the money. They had always been coming for the house. Min came on a Sunday. He always came on Sundays when he wanted something, because Sundays had been family days for most of his childhood, and he understood, in the way that people who study their parents understand, that certain days carry a residue of warmth that can be borrowed against. He arrived at 10 in the morning with a bag of fruit from the market, dragon fruit and rambutan, the kinds I liked, and the particular ease of a man who believes the situation is already resolved. I had been expecting him, not that Sunday specifically, but I had known, since Ha's call 3 days before, that Min would come soon. The property transfer declaration had been filed 8 months ago but not completed. Something had stalled it. And the only reason to stall a document you had already prepared was that you were waiting for a better moment, a moment when the obstacle was less attentive, less present, more manageable. He had been watching to see if I had noticed the bank account. He had decided I had not. And now, I suspected, he was moving to the next phase. I made tea. I set out the rambutan. I sat across from him at the kitchen table where I had sat across from him 1,000 times in his life. and I listened to him talk about nothing, the traffic, on the way over, a restaurant he had tried recently, a friend's wedding he was attending next month with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world, because I did. Then he set his phone on the table face down and shifted his posture slightly, and I recognized the shift because I had seen it in his father and in myself, and in every person who was about to change the register of a conversation. The small physical adjustment that says, "Now we are talking about the real thing." "Mom," he said, "I want to discuss the house." I peeled a rambutan, said nothing. He had prepared this speech. I could tell by the way it came out, not halting, not searching for words, but paced, measured, with the rhythm of something rehearsed enough to seem natural but not so rehearsed that it lost its emotional texture. He was good at this. He had always been good at talking, at finding the arrangement of words that made a thing sound reasonable, even inevitable. He said, the house was getting too large for me to manage alone. He said, maintenance costs were increasing. He said, property values in this area had peaked and would decline in the next few years, and it would be better to liquidate while the market was favorable. He said, he had already spoken to a property consultant. He did not say Tuan's name, but the shape of the absence was Tuan's shape, and the numbers were very good. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a property valuation document, a draft transfer agreement, and a page of figures that represented what I would receive, what he called my share, which was a remarkable choice of words for money from the sale of a house I owned entirely in my own name. I looked at the figures. I looked at the documents. I turned the pages at the speed of someone reading carefully, though I had stopped processing the content within the first 30 seconds, and was now simply performing the appearance of consideration while I observed him. He was relaxed. That was the thing I noticed most. His hands were loose on the table. His shoulders were down. He was watching me with the expression of a man who expects a negotiation, but is not worried about its outcome, because he has already determined the parameters. He was confident in a way that was not arrogance exactly, but was adjacent to it, the confidence of someone who has set the board and knows which pieces are where and believes the other player has not looked at the board carefully. He believed I did not know about the preliminary filing. He believed I did not know about the power of attorney. He believed I did not know about the notary office, or the notebook, or the 17 transfers, or the 212,000 dong that remained in an account that had once held everything I had built across 38 years of difficult work. He believed I was sitting across from him at this table the way I had always sat across from him, his mother, attentive and warm and fundamentally safe, the person who would always find a way to accommodate him because that is what mothers do and what he had counted on for 42 years. He had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully understood, that the woman who sat across from him had spent 38 years learning to appear calm in situations of genuine crisis. That composure and ignorance are not the same thing, that the still surface of water tells you nothing about its depth. I closed the folder. I folded my hands on top of it. This is a lot to consider, I said. Of course, he said, and the relief in his voice was almost imperceptible, almost. Take your time. But the market window, he glanced at his phone, is fairly short. The consultant says the next 60 days are optimal. 60 days. He had given me 60 days. I nodded slowly, as though I were considering the timeline. And Tuan is the consultant, I said, keeping my voice entirely conversational, as though I were asking whether he wanted more tea. Something moved across his face, too fast for someone less practiced at observation to catch. But I had sat at bedsides for 38 years reading the small, involuntary communications of faces that were trying very hard to communicate something else, and I caught it. He recovered immediately. He smiled. You know how it is, he said. He has contacts in property. It made sense to involve him. Of course, I said. We talked for another 40 minutes about nothing significant. He ate rambutan. He told me about the wedding he was attending. He asked if I needed anything from the market. At the door, leaving, he paused with his hand on the frame, his father's gesture, the one he had inherited without knowing it, and said, Mom, this is a good opportunity. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. I know, I said. He left. I stood at the window and watched his car until it turned the corner. Then I sat down and wrote in my notebook for 20 minutes, recording the conversation while it was still precise in my memory, his exact words, the order of them, the documents he had presented, the 60-day timeline, the absence of Twun's name until I had introduced it. 3 days later, Twun came alone. I had not expected this, and it was the first thing that had genuinely surprised me since the bank. He knocked at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was deliberate. Min had told him, or he had calculated, that I was likely to be home at that hour and unlikely to be expecting a visitor. He was dressed well, as always. He smiled the way he always smiled, with his mouth only. "Mrs. Hoa," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was in the area. People who are in the area do not visit the homes of their friends' mothers without calling first." I stepped aside and let him in because I wanted to see what he would do with access, and because I had already removed everything that mattered from every place he had previously found it. He sat in the living room. He accepted tea. He made conversation about nothing for 10 minutes, and I watched him the way I had watched patients who were in pain and trying not to show it, looking not at what they were presenting but at what was organizing the presentation. Then he said, gently, as though it had only just occurred to him, "Min mentioned he'd spoken to you about the house. I just wanted to say, as someone who cares about this family, that the offer really is very good, property in this area." "I understand the offer," I said. He nodded, still gentle, still careful. "And you're comfortable with the timeline? 60 days is generous, but if you need more time to think—" "I'm not going anywhere," I said. The sentence was simple. I meant it 2 ways. He heard one. He smiled. "Of course not. We want this to be comfortable for you." He left 20 minutes later. At the door, he shook my hand, firm, professional, the handshake of a man concluding a transaction he considers already done. That evening, I received a message from a number I did not recognize. No greeting, just an image, a scan of a document I had not seen before, my name at the top, a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be mine, not the power of attorney. Something else, a second document, agreeing to the property transfer, dated 2 weeks ago, signed, apparently, by me. I had been inside my house 2 weeks ago on the date listed. I had not signed anything. I had not left the house until the afternoon. I set the phone down, looked at Hung's altar. The candle was steady. They were not waiting for my agreement anymore. They had already manufactured it. The recording was 4 minutes and 37 seconds long. Ha sent it to me on a Thursday morning, without preamble, just a voice message preceding it that said, "I think you need to hear this before you do anything else." Then, the file. Then silence from her end, which was the silence of someone who has delivered something heavy and is standing back to let the weight settle on its own. I sat at my kitchen table. The morning light came through the window at the low angle it takes in November, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being examined rather than simply illuminated. My tea was hot. I had not yet touched it. I pressed play. The recording was from a phone call. The quality was clear, not a secret recording, not something captured covertly, but a call that had been recorded by one of the parties to it, in the ordinary way that business calls are sometimes recorded, and that had then made its way through the particular pathways that information finds when the right people are paying attention to Ha and from Ha to me. The first voice was Twun's. I recognized it immediately, the controlled, modulated quality of it, the voice of a man who had spent years in banking, learning to make every word sound reasonable. The second voice was Min's. I had known, intellectually, since the moment I saw Twun's name on the business registry filing, that Min was involved. I had known, in the way you know a thing when the evidence is clear and your mind is functioning properly, that he had participated. I had told myself I understood this. I had even written it in my notebook in plain language. Min knew. Min participated. The property transfer declaration was filed in both their names. But knowing a thing and hearing your son's voice say it are not the same experience. Twun spoke first. He said, "The second document is ready. Same method. I can file it next week if the timing works." Min said, "Wait until she goes to the community center. Thursday mornings. She's always out by 8 and doesn't come back until after 11. Twun said, "And she still hasn't said anything to you? About the account?" Min said, "Nothing. She doesn't check online. She only goes to the bank when she needs to withdraw cash, and she's been living on her pension. She hasn't needed to withdraw anything. She has no idea. I set the phone face down on the table. I sat with that for a moment. I looked at the window, at the pale morning light. I listened to the sound of the street outside, a motorbike passing, someone calling to their child. The ordinary Tuesday sounds of a neighborhood that did not know that inside this kitchen, in this particular moment, a woman was discovering the specific texture of what it feels like to have been watched and documented and managed by her own child, the child she had nursed for 3 days straight when he had a fever at age 4, the child whose homework she had stayed up past midnight to help with, the child for whom she had worked an extra shift every month for 2 years to afford a school trip to the north when he was 15 and had wanted to go, and she had found the money without telling him how. I picked the phone back up, pressed play again. Twun's voice. When the transfer goes through, we need to move quickly on the liquidation. The market is there now. 6 months from now, it may not be. Minja's voice. I know. The valuation is solid. If we can get her signature on the second document before she starts asking questions, we're done. Twun. And if she does start asking questions? A pause. 3 seconds. 4. Min's voice, quieter. In a register I had not heard from him before, not the Sunday voice, not the rehearsed voice, not the voice that brought fruit and spoke about weddings. A different voice, the voice you use when you are not performing anything. She won't. She's tired, she's old, she's still grieving. People like her, at her age, they don't fight, they accept, they trust their children. That's all she's ever done, trusted me. It's not complicated. The recording ended. I set the phone on the table and looked at it. People like her, at her age, they don't fight. I thought about the November 14 months ago, when I had sat in a grief group circle at the community center and held a paper cup of tea and listened to other people talk about the shape of loss, because I had needed to put the grief somewhere outside my own body for an hour, a week, and it had helped, and I had been grateful for the help. I had come home on those Thursday mornings to a house that was exactly as I had left it, the altar candle burning, Hung's photograph in its place, the lockbox on its shelf, not knowing that the week before, or the week before that, the framework for everything I was about to lose had already been designed and tested and set in motion. I had been in a circle of grieving people talking about love and loss while my son and his friend used my Thursday mornings to file documents in my name. I sat with this for a long time. I did not cry. I want to be precise about this, not because crying would have been weakness, it would not have been, but because what I felt in that moment was not the kind of pain that moves through you in tears. It was the kind that does not move at all. It sat in my chest, like a stone sits at the bottom of water still, dense, completely without motion, not going anywhere. Hung had loved Min without reservation. He had loved him in the specific way of fathers who see their flaws most clearly and choose the love anyway, who understand that their children are separate people, who will make choices they cannot control, and who decide that this is all right. That love is not conditional on the child being what you hoped. He had argued with Min about things, about money, about responsibility, about the tendency to take shortcuts and then expand the shortcut into a philosophy, but never without returning to warmth, never without the repair. In the last weeks of his life, when speech had become effortful, Hung had still asked about Min, whether he had called, whether he had eaten properly, whether he seemed all right. I had said yes, he had seemed all right. I thought about Hung asking me that from his bed, with the window light on his face and his hands folded on the blanket. And I thought about what Min had been doing at that time, which was, I now understood, beginning the process of registering a false notary business in preparation for exploiting my grief, and I felt something in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was the place where they overlap, the territory where sorrow becomes something harder. I opened my notebook. I wrote the date and time. I wrote, recording received, 4 minutes 37 seconds, voices confirmed, Min and Twun. Content, explicit confirmation of forged documents, surveillance of my schedule, strategy based on assumption that I would not investigate. Then I wrote, beneath it, in the same even handwriting I had used for 38 years on patient charts, they assumed I would accept. They were wrong. I called Pham Thuy Linh. She answered before the second ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant Ha had told her the recording was coming. The network of women who had quietly decided to help me was small but precise. Each person knowing exactly what they knew and nothing more, each one placed correctly. I told her about the recording. She asked me to send it immediately. I did. Then she said, "I have something for you as well." She had gone back to the bank. She had asked, through channels I did not ask her to specify, for the internal processing records on the power of attorney filing. Specifically, whether any bank employee had raised a concern at the time of filing and what had happened to that concern. Someone had raised a concern. A junior clerk who had processed the document and noted that the notary stamp was from an office she could not locate in the registry. She had flagged it to her supervisor. The supervisor had cleared it, with a note, "Document valid, client confirmed." The client confirmation had been obtained by phone. A phone call to a number listed on file as my secondary contact, added to my account 8 months prior, which I had not added and did not recognize. A phone number I established in the following hour with Ha's help, registered to a prepaid SIM purchased with cash and activated once, to confirm the document, then never used again. Someone had called that number, and the person who answered had said, "Yes, I am Thị Hoa, and yes, I have authorized this power of attorney." I sat in my kitchen with this information spread across the table in front of me, the bank records, the certified documents, the flagged concern that had been cleared by one phone call to a number that existed for exactly that purpose, and I looked at all of it together and understood, for the first time with the full weight of the understanding, what had been built here. This was not impulsive. This was not desperation. This was a structure, assembled piece by piece over a period of years, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and had prepared for the contingencies, and had thought through the failure modes and had concluded, correctly, that the primary risk was me, that the only thing that could unravel all of it was if I started asking questions. And they had decided I would not. They had looked at me, at a 68-year-old retired nurse sitting at her kitchen table with her cold tea and her husband's steady flame, and they had decided I was a manageable element. I closed my notebook. Outside, a cloud shifted, and the November light changed. And for a moment the kitchen was bright with a particular clarity of sun after overcast, everything sharp-edged and specific and exact. I thought about what Min had said on the recording, in that quieter register, the one without performance. She trusts her children. That's all she's ever done. He had said it as though it were a vulnerability. He did not understand yet that it was a choice, that it had always been a choice, and that I was capable of making different ones. I picked up my phone and sent Pham Thuy Lin one more message. "I am ready," I wrote. "Let's finish this. I have prepared patients for surgery many times in my career. Not the surgery itself that belonged to other hands, steadier in that particular way, trained for that particular precision, but the preparation, the careful sequencing of what needed to happen before the moment of intervention, the documentation that had to be in order, the timing that could not be rushed or compressed without consequence, the patient who needed to be calm and informed and exactly ready when the right moment arrived. I understood preparation as a discipline in itself, not the exciting part, not the visible part, the part that determined whether everything that followed would hold together or fall apart. I spent the 2 weeks after Ha's recording in preparation. I did not tell Min. I did not tell Tuan. I called Min on his Sunday as I always did, kept the conversation light, asked about his week, mentioned that I had been thinking about the house, and would need a little more time to consider the documents he had left. He said, "Of course, take all the time you need," in the voice that meant he was not concerned because he believed the second forged document made my consideration irrelevant. I said, "Thank you." I asked if he was eating properly. He said yes. I said good. I hung up and added the call to my notebook. Duration: 11 minutes. Content: routine. No new information. His voice: relaxed. Good. Relaxed men do not check their perimeters. The first thing I organized was the evidence itself, because evidence that exists, but cannot be presented clearly, is evidence that will not survive contact with a formal process. Pham Thuy Lin had explained this to me in her office. In the direct way she explained things, without softening or simplification, what we had was substantial. But substantial was not the same as airtight, and airtight was what we needed. We needed the evidence to tell a complete story. Not a story that required explanation or interpretation or the credibility of my word against my son's. A story the documents told by themselves. I spent 3 days organizing everything into a single folder, in chronological order, with a handwritten index on the first page that I drafted 4 times before I was satisfied with its precision. The index was not for me. I knew the contents without consulting it. The index was for anyone who would need to understand the situation quickly, completely, and without ambiguity. Page 1. Bank account transaction history, 18 months, certified. 17 withdrawals totaling 839,788,000 dong. Page 2. Power of attorney document, certified copy, with my annotations in the margins, noting the specific discrepancies between the signature and my verified signature, and the notary stamp inconsistency. Page 3. The Community Center Attendance Register from November, certified by the facility administrator, showing my name, my handwriting, and the timestamp of 8:47. On the same morning, the power of attorney was notarized at a location in District 7. Page 4. The Business Registry filing for the false notary office. Registration date. Tuan's name as administrative contact. Dissolution date. The gap between those dates and what they implied about the planning timeline. Page 5. Ha's documentation of the land registry filing. The preliminary property transfer declaration. Both names. The date. Page 6. The phone records establishing the prepaid SIM that had been used to confirm the power of attorney with the bank. 1 activation, 1 call, never used again. Page 7. The recording transcript. I had listened to the 4 minutes and 37 seconds 6 times and transcribed it myself, word for word, with timestamps, and then had the transcription verified against the audio by Pham Thuy Lin's office assistant, who did not know its origin and who confirmed the accuracy. Page 8. The message containing the second forged document, with metadata attached by a technician Ha had arranged, establishing the number of origin and the date and time of sending. I read the complete folder twice when it was assembled. Then I closed it and set it on the kitchen table and sat with my hands flat on the cover and looked at what 38 years of careful habit had made possible. If I had checked my account online, they might have seen me checking and adjusted their approach. If I had confronted Min in October, I would have had suspicion and hurt, but no documentation. If I had called Pham Thuy Lin the day I came home from the bank without first gathering what I had gathered, we would have had an account discrepancy and a missing notebook and almost nothing else. Instead, I had a folder 8 pages thick that told a story with no gaps and no ambiguity and no element that required my word against anyone else's. The second thing I organized was the timing. Pham Thuy Lin and I met on a Tuesday morning, early, before her first official appointment of the day, and we went through the options. She laid them out with the clarity I had come to rely on. Civil suit, criminal complaint, or both, in what sequence, and what the likely outcomes of each sequencing were. We talked for 2 hours. I asked questions and she answered them, and when she was done, I told her what I had decided and she nodded and said she thought that was correct. The criminal complaint would go first, filed with the documentation, complete, immediately, not as a threat, not as a negotiation, as a fact. The timing mattered. Min had given me 60 days. Ha had established, through her contact at the land registry, that the property transfer was moving toward completion not immediately, but within the month if I signed the second document, or if they found another way to move it forward. We could not wait for them to act. We needed to move before the transfer reached the stage where additional parties and financial arrangements complicated the picture. We set a date, 3 weeks out, enough time to file the complaint, notify the bank formally, and place a legal hold on any property transactions in my name. That left me with 3 weeks of ordinary life. I maintained my routine exactly as I had maintained it throughout. Thursday mornings at the community center. Wednesday evenings with the small group of retired nurses I had met with monthly for 12 years. Sunday calls to Min. Occasional small texts to Tuan's number, responses to his careful, friendly check-ins that revealed nothing. I visited Hung's altar every morning and every evening. I changed the incense. I changed the fruit. I spoke to him sometimes, not about the situation directly, but in the way you speak to someone who has known you long enough that you do not need to explain the context. I think you would be angry, I told him one evening. At Min, yes, but also at me, a little for not seeing it sooner. The candle was steady. I took that as neither agreement nor disagreement, just the presence I had come to rely on. What I did not do, in those 3 weeks, was grieve. Not yet. There would be time for that. I understood that what was coming was not only a legal process but a personal one, that the day I filed the complaint was the day I confirmed, in the eyes of institutions and eventually in the eyes of the people who knew us, what Min had chosen to be. That confirmation was going to cost something. I had looked at that cost clearly and decided I could bear it, and I had set the decision aside until it was required. You cannot grieve efficiently. But you can schedule when you allow yourself to begin. Ingok, at the shop, asked me once in those 3 weeks whether I was all right. She asked it in the oblique way of someone who has noticed something without being able to name what they noticed, not concern exactly, more like the attentiveness of a person who has been watching a weather pattern and cannot yet tell if it will be rain or simply clouds. I'm fine, I told her. Just organizing some things. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded and packed my tea, and didn't push. On the last evening before the filing date, I made the dinner I had made every year on Hung's birthday, the same dishes, the same order, the same proportions I had learned from his mother in 1982 and refined slightly over 40 years of making them. I set a place at the table for him, as I had done every year since he left, and I sat across from the empty place and ate slowly and thought about the life we had built together, and what it had cost, and what it had been worth, and what I was about to do in the name of protecting what remained of it. The house was quiet. The altar candle burned with its steady flame. Tomorrow, I would walk into a police station with a folder 8 pages thick and a handwritten index and 42 years of a mother's patience that had finally, completely, reached its end. And nothing, after that, was going to be the same. The bank branch manager's name was Mr. Thon, and he had the careful face of a man who understood, the moment we walked through his door, that this was not an ordinary appointment. Pham Thuy Lin had arranged it. Not as a confrontation, she had been precise about the language she used, precise about everything, but as a formal review meeting regarding irregularities in my account. The kind of language that banks respond to with seriousness, because banks understand that irregularities, once documented and ignored, become liabilities. She had requested that all parties with authorization on my account be present. She had sent the request in writing. She had copied the District Police Financial Crimes Unit on the correspondence, which was not a threat but a statement of fact. This matter had already been escalated, and this meeting was one part of a larger process that was already in motion. Min had come because he had no choice and because he did not yet understand that he had no choice. He thought he was walking into a room where I would be confused and upset and where his explanations would be sufficient. He had called me the night before, something he rarely did on a weeknight, and asked carefully what the meeting was about. I told him the bank had some questions about the account. He said he would come. Of course he would come. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He said that last part with complete sincerity. I noted it and said nothing. Tuan was not invited. That was deliberate. Pham Thuy Lin had explained her reasoning. Tuan's presence would give Min someone to look at, someone to calibrate against, a collaborator to exchange signals with, in real time. Alone, he would have only himself. That was the more useful condition. We sat in the manager's office, Mr. Than behind his desk, Pham Thuy Lin to my left, Min across the table. A junior officer from the Financial Crimes Unit sat in the corner with a notebook. Min looked at the officer once when he entered and then did not look at him again, which told me that the presence had registered and that Min was now managing his face with more attention than he had brought into the room. Mr. Thon opened the meeting. He explained, in the formal language of institutional procedure, that the bank had received documentation suggesting that one or more transactions on my account had been authorized through a fraudulent instrument and that a formal review was required. He said my attorney would be presenting the documentation. Pham Thuy Lin opened the folder. She did not rush. She placed the first page on the desk with the same unhurried precision with which she did everything. And she turned it so that it faced Min and Mr. Than equally, and she said, This is the transaction history for Mrs. Lathier Hoa's account for the past 18 months. Min looked at it. His face was arranged in an expression of attentive concern. He was very good at attentive concern. I had seen it all his life. She placed the second page. The power of attorney document. The third page. The community center attendance register. I watched Min's face as each page arrived on the table. I had spent 38 years watching faces. I knew what a face looks like when it is managing a genuine surprise versus when it is managing the revelation of something it already knew. Min's face, as each page appeared, showed not surprise but recalculation, the small, rapid adjustments of someone updating their model of what the other side knows. He knew I had the documents. He had understood that from the moment Pham Thuy Linh introduced herself as my attorney. What he was calculating now was how complete the picture was. Pham Thuy Linh placed the fourth page, the business registry filing, Tuan's name in the administrative contact field. Min looked at that page longer than the others. Something in his jaw moved. He set it back down. Mr. Thon, to his credit, read each document carefully before moving to the next. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one, and thoroughness was what this moment required. The junior officer in the corner wrote steadily. The fifth page. The land registry filing. The preliminary property transfer declaration. I watched Min's hands. They were flat on the table, which was deliberate hands hidden beneath the table move, and moving hands tell stories, and Min was too composed to allow that. But the flatness itself was effortful. I could see it in the slight rigidity of his fingers. The sixth page. The prepaid SIM phone record. The seventh page. The transcript. Min read the first 3 lines of the transcript and then stopped reading. He looked up from the page and looked at me directly, for the first time since we had sat down, and I looked back at him without expression and without looking away. He said, "Mom." Just that. Not a sentence. Not a defense. Just the word, the way you say a word when you have run out of everything else. I said nothing. I had been preparing for 38 years. Across every night shift and every difficult patient and every moment when the right thing was silence and not speech, for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when silence was the most precise instrument available. Pham Thuy Linh placed the 8th page. The metadata from the message containing the second forged document. The technician's notation establishing the origin number and the timestamp. Mr. Thon set down the last page and looked at Min. He did not look angry. He looked the way institutional people look when something has happened on their watch that should not have happened, not guilty, exactly, but aware that they are adjacent to a failure they will now be required to address. The power of attorney filed with this branch, he said carefully, was processed through our standard verification procedure. The verification call was made to a number listed on the account. Pham Thuy Linh said, a number added to the account without Mrs. Lay's knowledge or authorization, 8 months before the power of attorney was filed. We have the account modification record. It was not initiated in branch and it was not initiated by Mrs. Lay. Mr. Thon looked at that record. He said nothing for a moment. Then Min spoke. His voice was controlled and I recognized what the control was costing him. He said, I was trying to help. The account was she wasn't managing it well. After my father died, he stopped, looked at me again. Mom, I was trying to protect you. I protect her by taking everything she has? The room was very quiet. I said it without raising my voice. Without anger in the surface of it. Because the anger was there, but it was mine, and it was not for this room, not for performance. I said it the way I had said difficult things to patients for 38 years clearly, without cruelty, with the precision of someone who understands that clarity is its own form of kindness, because it does not allow the other person to hide in ambiguity. Min opened his mouth, then he closed it. I looked at him across the table and I thought about a Sunday morning 20 years ago when he had been 22 and had made a mistake with money, not a serious one, not even close to this, just a young man's careless error with a bill he had forgotten to pay. And I had sat with him at this same kind of table, not a bank, our kitchen table, and I had told him that the measure of a person was not whether they made mistakes but what they did the moment after. I had believed that then. I had tried to teach it. I had thought he had learned it. I thought about what he had said on the recording, in the voice I had not heard before, the voice without performance. She won't fight. She's old. She trusts. That's all she's ever done. And I thought about what he had said to Tuan in my kitchen in October, 3 feet from where I sat, believing I was too old to hear and too tired to notice and too worn down by grief to ask questions. She won't remember anyway. She's old now, confused. Whatever she signs, she won't know she signed it. I looked at my son across the table. I remembered, I said quietly, every word. He flinched, a small movement, barely visible. But I saw it because I had been watching him since he was 4 days old, and I knew every register of his face, and the flinch was real and involuntary, and it told me that he understood, finally and completely, what he had underestimated. Not my memory, not my money, me. Mr. Thon spoke then, in the measured voice of someone fulfilling a professional obligation he would prefer not to have been handed. He said that the bank would be freezing all account activity pending the formal investigation. He said that the power of attorney had been suspended. He said that any pending property transactions would be flagged with the land registry immediately. The junior officer in the corner closed his notebook and stood. Ming did not move. He sat very still in his chair with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the stack of 8 pages and the particular expression of a person who has just understood that the floor they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. I picked up my copy of the folder and put it in my bag. I stood. I did not say goodbye. There was nothing left to say that the documents had not already said. More precisely and more permanently than any words I could have chosen. I walked out of Mr. Thon's office into the bank's main hall, where the ordinary morning was continuing. A young woman at the counter, an older man filling out a form, the neutral hum of fluorescent lights, and I walked through it and out the front door into the November air, which was cool and carried the smell of rain that had not yet arrived. Pham Thuy Lin came out 30 seconds behind me. She stood beside me and neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said, "That was very well done." I looked at the street. The motorbikes. The vendor on the corner selling banh mi, the smell of it reaching us even from this distance, warm bread and something savory, the smell of an ordinary morning. I said, "It was 38 years in preparation." She nodded. Then she said, "It's not over yet." "I know," I said. "But this part was." Tuan called Min at 2:47 inches the afternoon on the same day as the bank meeting. I know this because Pham Thuy Lin's contact at the Financial Crimes Unit, the junior officer who had sat in the corner of Mr. Thon's office with his notebook, was thorough in ways that extended beyond the meeting itself. Phone records, once a formal complaint has been filed and a case number assigned, become accessible through channels that operate with their own quiet efficiency. The call lasted 19 minutes. I was not told the content of those 19 minutes, but I did not need to be. What I was told was what happened next. Tuan arrived at the police district office the following morning without being summoned. He arrived at 8:43, before most appointments began, in the suit he wore when he wanted to be taken seriously, which told me everything about what he believed walking in. He asked to speak to someone in charge. He was directed to a desk. He sat down and, before anyone had asked him a single question, began to explain. I was told this by Ha, who had a friendship with a woman who worked the administrative desk at that office, which is the kind of connection that exists in a city where people have lived their whole lives and built relationships across 30 and 40 years of proximity. The woman at the desk had not been involved in the case. She simply described what she had seen, a well-dressed man who came in without being called and sat down and started talking. Tuan told them that the scheme had been Min's idea, that he had been reluctant, that he had raised concerns, that his involvement had been limited to the technical aspects, the notary registration, the document preparation, and that he had not been present for any of the direct interactions with me, which was true in the narrow sense and false in every sense that mattered. He produced his own documents. He had brought documents with him, which meant he had prepared for this, which meant he had spent the 19 minutes of that phone call calculating, and had concluded that the calculation favored him arriving first. Min arrived at the same office 40 minutes later. He had not been told that Tuan had already come. He was shown to a different desk, in a different room, by someone who knew how to arrange these things, and he sat down and, after a shorter silence than Tuan had managed, began to explain that the scheme had been Tuan's idea, that he had been presented with it as an investment arrangement, that he had not fully understood the legal dimensions, that Tuan had handled all the documentation, that Tuan had connections at the bank from his years in the industry, that Tuan had designed the entire structure. Neither of them mentioned, in their separate and contradictory accounts, that the recording existed. They learned about the recording later that afternoon, when it was presented to them together, in a room where they were finally in the same space again, and I was told that the silence that followed the playing of the recording lasted nearly a full minute before either of them spoke, and that when they did speak it was simultaneously, and the words they chose contradicted each other so completely that the officer managing the meeting had to ask them both to stop. I was not present for any of this. I was at home. I had come home from the bank that morning and changed out of my good clothes and put on the plain house dress I wore for ordinary days and made tea and sat in the kitchen. I had turned the radio on to the channel that played older music, the kind Hung had liked, and I let it fill the house the way sound fills a house when you have been alone in it long enough to understand the particular quality of its silence. I did not make calls. I did not check my phone. I sat and drank my tea and let the morning happen around me. Nok came by at noon with a container of soup she said she had made too much of, which was the language we used between us for checking on each other without requiring the other person to admit they needed checking on. I thanked her. We ate together at my kitchen table, and she did not ask about anything and I did not offer anything, and we talked about a mutual acquaintance who had recently moved to a new apartment and whether the new area suited her. Pham Thuy Linh called at 4. Her voice was composed, as it always was, but beneath the composure there was something that in another person might have been satisfaction, and in her expressed itself as a particular crispness of diction, every word landing with extra precision. She told me about Tuan's arrival at the police office, about Min's arrival 40 minutes later, about the recording and the silence and the simultaneous and contradictory explanations. She told me that both of them had, in their separate sessions, provided enough information about the other's involvement to establish a complete picture without requiring my testimony to fill any gaps. They had, between the two of them, documented the entire scheme in an attempt to minimize their own roles, and the sum of what they had provided was more comprehensive than what we had assembled in the folder. People who build elaborate structures together, she said, are never quite as loyal to each other as they are to themselves when the structure begins to fall. I already knew this. I had watched enough people under pressure in 38 years to understand that the alliances built on shared advantage are the most precisely calibrated to hold right up until the moment they are not advantageous, at which point they dissolve with a speed that always seems surprising to the people inside them. The bank formally reversed the power of attorney that same afternoon. The land registry hold was confirmed. The preliminary property transfer declaration was flagged as involving a fraudulent instrument and suspended pending investigation. Mr. Thon called Pham Thuy Linh to confirm these actions and to indicate that the bank was conducting an internal review of how the original filing had been processed, which was the institutional language for, "We are also trying to understand how this happened on our watch." I listened to all of this on the phone, standing in my kitchen with the afternoon light coming in at a low angle and the soup ngok had brought still warm on the stove, and the radio playing something I did not recognize, but which had the right quality of melody for the particular ensoflag. Feeling of the moment not triumphant, not celebratory, quieter than that. There is something I want to say about what it felt like, because I think if I do not say it here, I will not say it anywhere, and it should be said precisely. It did not feel like winning. I want to be careful about this because I think the word winning implies a competition, a game, two sides with equal standing and equal investment, and that is not what this was. What this was the restoration of something that should never have been disturbed. It felt, if I am honest, less like triumph and more like the feeling at the end of a very long surgery when you finally allow yourself to look up from the work and discover that the patient has made it through, not joy. Relief of a very specific kind, the kind that is adjacent to exhaustion, that has nothing to celebrate because celebration implies the alternative was acceptable. The alternative here was never acceptable. My son had looked at me, had looked at a woman who had worked for 38 years and built something real with careful hands and loved him for 42 years without reservation, and had decided that what I had built existed for his use, had decided that my age made me manageable, had decided that my grief made me distracted. had decided that my trust, which was the thing I had given him most freely and most completely across his entire life, was a vulnerability to be exploited. She won't fight. She's old. She trusts. That's all she's ever done. He had said it as though trust were a flaw, as though the 42 years of showing up, of staying, of building and giving and remaining were a kind of dimness, a failure of sophistication. I thought about all the things I had done that he had categorized as trust. The midnight homework, the extra shifts, the school trip, the phone calls on Sundays even after I knew what I knew, maintaining the surface of ordinary life because the investigation required it, the way I had sat across from him at my own kitchen table and listened to his prepared speech about property values, and smiled at the appropriate moments and said I would need a little more time to consider, with the complete serenity of someone who had already filed a criminal complaint 6 days before and whose attorney had already confirmed the case number. That was not trust. That was precision. That was 38 years of understanding exactly when silence was the most powerful instrument available. The phone call with Pham Thuy Linh ended. I set the phone on the table. Outside, the mango tree moved in a wind I could not feel from inside. Its shadow crossed the kitchen window the way it did every late afternoon, the slow movement of something large and rooted, making its ordinary passage across the light. Hung had planted that tree 42 years ago with his hands in the dark with a flashlight. Because he wanted something that would take 10 years to bear fruit, and he wanted us to be there when it did. I had been there. I was still here. I went to the altar and changed the incense, and stood for a while in the thin blue smoke of it, in the small ceremony of continuity, and I said to Hung's photograph not out loud, just in that interior space where I still talked to him, I said, "It is done." The candle flame was steady. Tomorrow would bring its own requirements. Formal statements, legal proceedings, the long administrative work of correction that always follows the moment of revelation. Min's face in that bank office. Tuan arriving first, calculating, preparing to use 40 years of friendship as material for his own defense. All of that was ahead. But tonight, the incense burned, and the mango tree moved in its ordinary way outside the window, and somewhere in the city, 2 men who had built their plans on the assumption that I was too old and too tired and too trusting to look carefully at what was happening around me were sitting with the full weight of having been wrong. I had looked. I had remembered everything. I had simply waited until I had enough. The legal process took 4 months. I say this plainly because I want to be precise about what those 4 months contained, which was not drama in the way that people imagine when they hear the word legal process. It was paperwork and appointments and the particular rhythm of institutions moving at their own pace, which is slower than urgency demands and faster than despair expects. Pham Thuy Linh handled the formal proceedings with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and I attended what I was required to attend and signed what I was required to sign and answered questions when questions were asked, in the same clear, unhurried voice I had used at Mr. Than's desk. Min and Tuan had separate legal representation by the end of the first week. That told me everything about the durability of what they had built together. The bank restored my account. Not immediately. There was a process, documentation, a review committee, the particular caution of an institution acknowledging its own failure without quite saying so directly. But the money came back, all of it. 839,788,000 dong, returned in a transfer that appeared on a Tuesday morning in March as a line item on a statement I reviewed at the same branch, at the same desk, with a different young man who had clearly been briefed and who handled the appointment with careful professionalism and did not quite meet my eyes. I thanked him. I meant it. He had not been there when it happened. He was simply the person present now, doing his job. And that deserved acknowledgement. The property transfer declaration was formally nullified. The preliminary filing was removed from the registry. The house remained in my name, as it had been since 1987. As it would remain for as long as I chose to keep it. I chose to keep it. I want to say something about the money, because I think it would be easy to read this story and conclude that the money was the point. It was not. The money was the instrument, the thing they had used to try to reach what they actually wanted, which was the house, and through the house, everything the house represented. The security Hung and I had built across 40 years, the permanence of it, the fact that it was mine, clearly and completely mine, the product of 38 years of 12-hour shifts and careful saving and the discipline of two people who understood that what you build slowly and deliberately does not disappear easily. They had wanted to make it disappear easily. They had failed. But I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story that ends with a simple accounting: money taken, money returned, justice delivered, conclusion, and that version would be dishonest. The money came back. What had been done with it did not unhappen. The planning, the timeline, the notary office registered while Hung was still alive, and the disease was still progressing, and I was still sitting at his bedside learning how much time we had that had happened. The October evening in the kitchen, my son's voice 3 feet away, the casual certainty that I was too old to understand what was being said around me that had happened. Some things, once placed into the world, remain there. You do not get to take them back by reversing the financial transaction. What you get is the truth, clearly documented, formally acknowledged, no longer something you carry alone in a notebook with a brown cover that looks like a grocery list. I spent the months of the legal process doing what I had always done. I went to the community center on Thursday mornings. I met with my retired nurse friends on Wednesday evenings. I tended the altar. I changed the incense. I ate properly, which Knock monitored with the attentiveness of someone who had decided this was her responsibility and was not going to be argued out of it. In April, when the formal proceedings had concluded and the documentation was complete and Pham Thuy Linh had called to say the final words that needed to be said in her official capacity, I did something I had been considering for some time. I called my sister in the next district. We had lunch. I told her everything, not a summary, not the version that protects the listener from discomfort, but everything, in the order it had happened, the way you tell the truth to someone who has known you long enough to receive it without flinching. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her. I know, I said. I wasn't ready. She nodded. She understood the difference between secrecy and readiness. I took the money, the restored amount, the full sum, and I did with it what I had always intended. Not the same specific plans Hung and I had made, because some of those plans had belonged to a future that no longer existed in its original form, but the intention behind them, careful, deliberate, directed toward what actually mattered. I made a donation to the hospital where I had worked for 38 years, specifically to the pediatric ward, where I had begun, where I had learned what it meant to pay attention to people who could not always tell you in words what they needed. The ward had been trying for 2 years to fund a small family waiting area, a room where parents could sit during long procedures without standing in a hallway. It was a modest thing. It cost less than I had imagined such things cost. It would exist now, with a small plaque on the wall that said something plain and true about the value of staying. I made a second arrangement, through Pham Thuy Linh, establishing a formal legal document, the real kind, properly notarized at an office that existed at a verifiable address by a notary, whose credentials I personally confirmed directing the house, after my death, to the hospice organization that had cared for Hung in his final weeks. They had done their work with a gentleness I had recognized as professional and felt as personal, and they had not received adequate recognition for it, and that was something I was in a position to address. The house would go to people who understood that presence was the most valuable thing you could offer someone at the end of their life. I felt Hung would have found this appropriate. In May, on a Thursday morning after the community center, I came home and stood in the backyard under the mango tree for a while. It was a warm morning, the kind that comes before the real heat of summer arrives, still carrying a residual coolness in the shade. The tree was enormous now, its canopy extending far beyond what Hung had imagined when he dug the hole in the dark with his flashlight in 1987, and the mangoes were beginning to form, small and green, and months away from ripeness. I had an appointment at 2 in the afternoon. Not legal. Not institutional. Min had asked, through an intermediary who was neither Pham Thuy Linh nor anyone connected to the case, whether I would be willing to meet. Just to talk, no agenda, no request. Just a conversation. I had thought about it for 3 weeks before saying yes. Not because I had forgiven him. I want to be precise about this also, because forgiveness is a word people reach for when they want to simplify something that is not simple. What I had was something different, not forgiveness, not its absence, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement that Min was my son, and that this fact existed independent of what he had done and independent of what I felt about it, and that I was not the kind of person who refused to sit in a room with a fact just because the fact was difficult. I would sit with the fact. I would see what it had to say. I did not know what would come of it. I did not need to know in advance. I had spent enough of my life learning that the outcomes of difficult things reveal themselves over time and cannot be rushed or predicted, only met with whatever steadiness you have managed to build across the years of your life. I had built considerable steadiness. The mango tree shifted above me in a small wind, its leaves turning briefly to show their pale undersides. The same gesture it had made all the years I had stood beneath it, unconcerned, unhurried, doing exactly what mango trees do across decades of weather and season and the ordinary passage of time. I went inside. I changed the incense. I sat with my tea. And I remembered what my grandmother had told me when I was a girl, too impatient for things to arrive at their proper pace, her voice patient, her hands steady, her eyes on whatever she was doing rather than on me, because the lesson was not about eye contact, it was about the truth of the thing itself. Still water, she had said, still water runs deepest. I had been still for 68 years, and I was still here. To every mother and father who has been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly betrayed by the people they loved most, your silence was never weakness. It was wisdom, waiting for the right moment. The years you spent building, giving, and enduring were never wasted. They were your strength. And strength like that does not disappear. It waits. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to Golden Years Justice. Every week we bring you more stories about dignity, patience, and the quiet power of those who refuse to be forgotten. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe that trust, once broken by family, can ever truly be rebuilt, or are some betrayals simply too deep to come back from?